They refused to bow, refused to burn incense, refused to call any man a god. And for that simple refusal, they became enemies of the most powerful empire on earth. In the vast Roman Empire, loyalty was measured not only by obedience to law, but by worship. Honoring the Roman gods and the emperor was seen as a civic duty, a public act that proved your allegiance to the state. But early Christians could not do this. Their faith allowed worship of only one God, and their loyalty belonged to Christ alone. To Roman authorities, this was not just religious difference, it looked like political defiance. Rumors spread quickly. Christians were accused of being secretive, unpatriotic, even dangerous. Sever's hint. Their refusal to participate in public rituals made them stand out in a society built on conformity. As fear and misunderstanding grew, suspicion turned into discrimination, and discrimination into persecution. At times it was quiet and local. At other times, it erupted into empire-wide crackdowns that tested the limits of human endurance. Yet what makes this story unforgettable is not the power of Rome, but the courage of those who stood against it without weapons, without armies, and without political influence. Ordinary men and women merchants, soldiers, slaves, and mothers chose faith over safety, conviction over comfort. They did not seek conflict, but they refused to deny what they believed was truth. This is not just a story about suffering. It is a story about resilience, about how an empire that tried to silence a small religious movement instead helped spread it across the ancient world, and about how faith, when tested, can shape history in ways no ruler can control. If you are ready to journey into one of the most powerful chapters of early Christian history, stay with us. And before we begin, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories that shaped the world we live in today. As fear of Christianity spread through the Roman world, the empire faced a dilemma it could not easily resolve. Rome prided itself on order, law, and tradition, yet this new faith did not fit neatly into any existing category. Christians were not rebels plotting uprisings, nor were they simply another exotic cult that could be absorbed into the vast Roman religious system. They lived quietly among their neighbors, paid taxes, obeyed civil laws, yet drew a firm line where worship was concerned. That quiet refusal forced Roman leaders to decide how far the state should go in enforcing loyalty. Under Emperor Trajan, this tension crystallized into official policy. Christianity was not declared illegal through sweeping legislation, but it was not protected either. Instead, the empire adopted a cautious, calculated approach. Comistems placisime. Christians were not to be hunted down or actively sought out, which helped preserve the appearance of justice and restraint. However, once accused and brought before authorities, the line became clear. If they refused to renounce their faith and perform the expected public rituals, punishment followed. To Roman officials, this was not about belief itself, but about visible obedience to imperial tradition. This policy created a dangerous balance. On the surface, it restrained uncontrolled violence and discouraged chaos driven by rumor or mob anger. At the same time, it placed Christians in a constant state of vulnerability. Any accusation, whether sincere or malicious, could drag them before a tribunal. Their fate depended on a single question: would they comply, or would they stand firm? For many, the cost of refusal was severe, yet compliance meant denying the core of their identity. The law did not force them to believe differently, but it demanded a public gesture they could not make. Hadrian, Trajan's successor, refined this approach further. Concerned with maintaining legal integrity across the empire, he sought to curb abuses that arose from personal vendettas or mass hysteria. False accusations were no longer to be tolerated, and charges against Christians required evidence of actual wrongdoing rather than vague hostility. This adjustment offered limited protection and momentary relief to Christian communities, particularly in regions where hostility had been fueled by fear rather than fact. Yet the underlying issue remained unchanged. Christianity was still seen as incompatible with the religious foundations of Roman civic life. What emerged during this period was not a consistent experience of peace or violence, but a fragile uncertainty. In some cities, Christians lived quietly for years, practicing their faith without interference. In others, a sudden shift in local leadership or public sentiment could turn neighbors into accusers overnight. The empire's policy, though measured in theory, left enormous power in the hands of provincial governors, their personal beliefs, political ambitions, Constantinas, or desire to please the crowd, often determined whether Christians would be ignored or punished. This inconsistency shaped the character of early Christianity in profound ways. Believers learned that safety was temporary and conditional, never guaranteed by law or status. Faith became something lived daily under quiet pressure rather than dramatic confrontation. The decision to remain Christian was not a single heroic moment, but a continual act of resolve, renewed each time loyalty was questioned. Communities supported one another, sharing resources, stories, and hope, aware that their circumstances could change without warning. Ironically, Rome's attempt to manage Christianity through controlled restraint may have strengthened it. By avoiding indiscriminate slaughter while still enforcing conformity, the empire forced Christians to articulate who they were and why they believed. Each trial, each demand to recant, sharpened the boundaries of faith and deepened commitment among those who remained. What Roman authorities viewed as a manageable problem slowly became something more enduring, rooted not in law or force, but in conviction. This phase of persecution did not extinguish Christianity, nor did it fully embrace it. Instead, it revealed the growing gap between imperial order and personal belief, a gap that would widen in the centuries to come. The empire believed it had found a stable solution, but beneath the surface, a quiet transformation was already underway. As the Roman Empire moved deeper into the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, the fragile balance that had defined earlier policy began to fracture. The careful restraint practiced under previous emperors did not disappear, but it became increasingly dependent on local conditions and the temperament of those in power. This was the era when persecution no longer felt distant or theoretical for many Christian communities. It arrived suddenly, shaped by fear, public pressure, and the belief that unity could only be preserved through conformity. Under Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a ruler remembered for his philosophy and discipline, Christians found themselves facing renewed hostility. Although he did not issue sweeping decrees calling for their destruction, his reign coincided with natural disasters, military threats, and social unrest. In times of crisis, Roman society looked for causes and culprits, and Christians often stood apart as convenient targets. Their refusal to participate in public religious rites was interpreted as a rejection of the very traditions believed to protect the empire. Local officials, eager to restore order or appease anxious crowds, acted with increasing severity. In cities across the empire, accusations spread quickly. Christians were pushed out of public life, excluded from markets and social spaces, and summoned before authorities. Trials became public spectacles, designed not only to enforce the law, but to send a message. A simple act of compliance could end the ordeal, yet many chose otherwise, not out of defiance, but out of conviction. These moments transformed ordinary believers into symbols, and their choices echoed far beyond the courtroom. One of the most striking episodes of this period unfolded in Roman Gaul, in what is now modern-day Lyon. There, fear and rumor fueled a wave of repression that shocked even contemporary observers. Christians were arrested, interrogated, and condemned under intense pressure. Their suffering was intended to discourage others, but instead it strengthened the identity of the Christian community. Letters describing these events circulated widely, not to glorify pain, but to testify to endurance and faith under trial. As time passed, the pattern repeated under different rulers, including Septimius Severus. His reign marked another turning point, particularly in regions like North Africa, where Christianity was growing rapidly. Concerned about social cohesion and the spread of new religious movements, Severus appears to have restricted conversions, making public commitment to Christianity increasingly risky. Once again, enforcement varied widely, but the consequences for those caught in its path were life-altering. It was during this era that the stories of Perpetua and Felicity emerged, leaving a lasting imprint on Christian memory. Perpetua, a young woman of noble background, and Felicity, a woman of humble status, stood side by side in their shared faith despite their very different social positions. Their story revealed something Rome could not easily understand or control, a belief that erased conventional boundaries of class, gender, and status. In a society built on hierarchy, this quiet equality was unsettling. What made their story endure was not simply the outcome, but the humanity it revealed. Perpetua's writings, Concili, preserved by early Christians, offered a rare personal voice from within the experience of persecution. She wrote not with bitterness, but with clarity and calm resolve, reflecting on family, loyalty, and faith. Felicity's presence alongside her underscored the communal nature of early Christianity, where belief bound people together more strongly than social divisions ever could. These localized persecutions did not follow a single script, nor were they constant across the empire. In some places, Christians lived in relative peace, while in others, a sudden shift in leadership or public mood could bring swift repression. This unpredictability shaped a generation of believers who learned to live without guarantees, trusting neither in imperial favor nor legal protection, but in the strength of their shared conviction. By this point in the story, it was becoming clear that persecution was no longer an exception or a misunderstanding. It was a recurring response to a faith that refused to blend in, and yet, each attempt to suppress it seemed to deepen its roots. The stories of Marcus Aurelius's reign and the martyrs under Septimius Severus did not mark the end of Christianity's struggle, but they revealed something essential: that faith sustained quietly, even under pressure, could endure forces far greater than itself. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was no longer dealing with Christianity as a marginal or local concern. What had once been handled unevenly by provincial governors now appeared, to imperial leaders, as a challenge that spanned the entire Roman world. Political instability, Polizende classism, external threats, economic strain, and recurring disasters created a sense that the empire itself was under pressure. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, unity was no longer a preference but a necessity, and religious conformity was seen as a tool to restore order. Emperor Decius approached the problem with unprecedented scope. Unlike earlier rulers, he did not single out Christians by name, nor did he rely on sporadic enforcement. Instead, he introduced a universal requirement that cut across class, region, and status. Every citizen was expected to perform a public act of sacrifice to the traditional gods and to the spirit of the empire itself. Compliance was recorded and certified, turning loyalty into a documented obligation rather than a symbolic gesture. On the surface, the policy appeared neutral, but its impact fell heavily on Christian communities. For Christians, the demand struck at the heart of their faith. This was not a private test of belief, but a public declaration that could not be reinterpreted or hidden. Refusal meant consequences that were now standardized and unavoidable. Trials multiplied, not driven by mobs or rumor, but by administrative order. Some were imprisoned, others sent into exile, and many faced death for their continued refusal to comply. The empire had transformed persecution into policy, leaving little room for discretion or delay. The pressure was immense, and not all responses were the same. Some Christians, overwhelmed by fear or concern for their families, chose to comply. Others obtained certificates through bribery or intermediaries without performing the act themselves. Many, however, stood firm, accepting the consequences rather than compromise what they believed defined their identity. This diversity of responses exposed a new struggle, one that unfolded not between Christians and Rome, but within the Christian community itself. When Decius' reign ended abruptly, the trauma he left behind did not fade with him. Churches were forced to confront difficult questions that had no easy answers. Should those who had complied under pressure be welcomed back, or had they permanently broken faith with their community? Could repentance restore what had been publicly denied? These debates were not abstract theological disputes, but deeply personal conflicts that touched families, friendships, and leadership structures. Unity, already strained by external threats, now faced internal fracture. The reign of Valerian soon reopened these wounds. Initially more restrained, his policy hardened over time, focusing particularly on Christian leaders and those of high social standing. Bishops, elders, and prominent believers were targeted, not simply to punish individuals, but to weaken the organizational heart of the church. Confiscation of property, loss of status, and forced separation became tools of enforcement. Christian women of noble families were stripped of privilege, while leaders were removed from their communities, leaving believers without guidance in moments of fear. Yet even in this calculated repression, the pattern of endurance continued. Figures such as Cyprian of Carthage emerged as voices of clarity amid confusion, addressing both the suffering inflicted by the state and the divisions within the church. His writings reflected a struggle to balance discipline with mercy, urging unity without denying the seriousness of public denial. These debates shaped Christian thought in lasting ways, forcing communities to define forgiveness, authority, and belonging under extreme pressure. Valerian's capture by foreign forces abruptly ended his campaign, and his successor moved quickly to restore stability by easing restrictions. For Christians, this brought temporary relief, but the scars remained. Entire communities had been reshaped by fear, courage, compromise, and loss. The memory of empire-wide enforcement lingered, reminding believers that tolerance could vanish as quickly as it appeared. This period marked a turning point in the story of persecution. Christianity was no longer merely reacting to local hostility, but navigating survival under coordinated imperial pressure. At the same time, it was wrestling with its own identity, learning how to remain united when faith was tested not only by external force, but by the choices of its own members. What emerged was a church more self-aware, more structured, and more conscious of the cost of belief, prepared, though unwilling, for the trials still ahead. By the time Diocletian rose to power, the Roman Empire was exhausted by decades of instability, civil wars, economic strain, and external threats had weakened the sense of unity that once held the vast territory together. Diocletian believed the empire could only survive through strict order, clear hierarchy, and a return to traditional Roman values. Religion, long intertwined with political loyalty, became central to his vision of restoration. Christianity, now widespread and deeply rooted across the empire, stood apart as a visible reminder of difference in a system that demanded uniformity. At first, the pressure was subtle. Christians were removed from positions of influence, especially within the military and imperial administration. Participation in state rituals became more closely monitored, and refusal was no longer quietly overlooked. These early measures signaled a shift from uneasy tolerance to deliberate exclusion. Still, many believers hoped this would be another temporary wave, like those that had passed before. They had endured uncertainty under earlier emperors and learned to survive in the margins. Few could imagine what was coming. The turning point arrived when Diocletian, influenced by his co-emperor Galerius, committed to a decisive course of action. What followed was not sporadic repression or regional hostility, but a coordinated effort unlike anything Christians had faced before. Imperial edicts were issued with clear intent. Christianity was to be dismantled systematically. Places of worship were ordered to be torn down, sacred texts confiscated and destroyed, and public gatherings forbidden. The faith was no longer merely restricted. Its visible presence was targeted for erasure. Across cities and villages, the impact was immediate and devastating. Churches that had stood quietly for generations were reduced to ruins. Scriptures, painstakingly copied by hand and treasured by communities, were seized and burned. For believers, this was more than material loss. These spaces and texts were anchors of memory and identity, connecting them to one another and to their faith. Their destruction was meant to break continuity, to sever the past from the present. As enforcement intensified, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Christians who refused to comply with official demands faced harsh penalties that varied by region but shared a common goal: compliance through fear. Some were imprisoned or sent to labor under brutal conditions, while others were stripped of their property and freedom. Families were separated, communities scattered, and leaders removed. The aim was not only punishment, but exhaustion, wearing down resistance until faith itself seemed unsustainable. The severity of this period was not uniform throughout the empire. In the western provinces, enforcement was often restrained, shaped by local rulers who showed reluctance or indifference. In the eastern regions, where Galerius held greater influence, Repression was relentless and systematic. This uneven experience added to the confusion and fear, as Christians in one region heard stories of devastation in another, never knowing when or if the same fate would reach them. Yet even in this darkest chapter, the expected outcome did not materialize. Instead of dissolving, Christian communities adapted. Believers gathered in secret, memorized sacred texts to preserve them when written copies were lost, and supported one another quietly. Leadership shifted from public roles to hidden networks, and faith became more internal, less dependent on structures that could be destroyed. What had once relied on visible institutions learned to survive through shared conviction alone. Over time, the relentless pressure took its toll, not only on Christians, but on the empire itself. The policy demanded constant enforcement, resources, and attention, deepening unrest rather than restoring stability. When Galerius fell gravely ill, he reportedly interpreted his suffering as a sign that the campaign had failed. In a striking reversal, he issued an edict allowing Christians to exist openly once more, asking them in return to pray for the welfare of the empire. The persecution under Diocletian and Galerius marked the final and most severe attempt to eliminate Christianity through force. It was meant to be the end of the story. Instead, it became a turning point. The faith emerged battered but unbroken, stripped of buildings and books, yet strengthened in identity. What followed would transform Christianity's place in history, but this moment stands as proof that even the most determined power could not extinguish belief sustained by conviction rather than fear. After generations marked by fear, loss, and quiet endurance, the long night of persecution finally began to lift. In the early 4th century, the Roman Empire stood once again at a crossroads. Years of internal conflict and failed attempts to enforce unity through repression had proven one thing with clarity. Persecution had not destroyed Christianity. Instead, it had revealed its resilience. It was in this moment of transition that Constantine emerged as a decisive figure in the story. In 313 AD, Constantine, together with Licinius, issued what would become known as the Edict of Milan. This decree did not declare Christianity the official religion of the empire, nor did it force belief upon the population. Its significance lay in something far more radical for its time. It granted full legal tolerance to Christianity. For the first time, Christians were no longer criminals simply for their faith. They were allowed to worship openly, to gather without fear, and to reclaim property that had been taken during the persecutions. For Christian communities, the impact was profound. Believers who had spent generations meeting in secret could now step into public life without hiding. Churches were rebuilt, scriptures recopied, and leaders returned from exile. Families that had been fractured by fear and loss began to heal. Faith, once sustained in whispers and shadows, could now be expressed openly, shaping culture, charity, and public life. Yet the Edict of Milan was more than an act of tolerance. It marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between faith and power. Christianity was no longer defined solely by suffering. The same movement that had survived without protection now faced a new challenge: how to live when belief no longer carried an immediate cost. Over the following decades, Christianity gained influence, favor, and eventually authority, culminating in its recognition as the empire's official religion later in the century. This transformation did not erase the memory of persecution. The stories of those who endured hardship, imprisonment, and death remained central to Christian identity. Their faith had been tested not in theory, but in lived experience. They stood firm when belief meant loss, and their legacy shaped the values of the generations that followed. The rise of Christianity was not built on force or conquest, but on endurance, conviction, and community. Looking back, the arc of this history is striking. An empire that once tried to silence a small group of believers ended up reshaped by the very faith it sought to suppress. The Roman state could destroy buildings and ban gatherings, but it could not erase belief rooted in conscience. The Edict of Milan stands as a reminder that power enforced through fear is temporary, while conviction sustained through meaning can endure across centuries. As we bring this story to a close, it is worth remembering that this history is not only about the past. It speaks to the human capacity to remain faithful under pressure, to hold on to identity in the face of uncertainty, and to find strength in shared belief. The early Christians did not know how their story would end, yet they lived as though truth was worth the cost. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for listening to this journey through one of the most defining chapters of Christian history. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you won't miss future stories that shape the world we live in today. Your support helps keep these stories alive and shared with others. Keep these stories alive and shared with others. Keep these